throughout this webinar, you'll be able to type in questions and comments in the chat box, so please keep that in mind. This webinar, we're going to talk about shipping hay outside the fire ant quarantine. My name is Kelly Lofton. I'm an entomologist at Arkansas. We've got other speakers, and they will be Charles Brown. He's the Imported Fire Ant Quarantine Policy Manager with APHIS PPQ. Anne Marie Calcott, entomologist with APHIS PPQ. And Ron Weeks, another entomologist with APHIS PPQ. The topics we'll cover tonight, first, the reason we're having this webinar, and then regulatory requirements, best management practices, identification and management of new and imported fire ant infestations outside quarantine areas. Those are the main topics. The reason we're having this webinar, the drought of 2012 led to the importation and transportation of large quantities of baled hay from fire ant infested areas to non-infested areas. Normally during drought years, the majority of hay is produced and sold locally, meaning that many hay brokers and customers are unaware of the regulatory requirements and best management practices aimed at preventing the spread of imported fire ants into these non-infested areas. If we look at the drought monitor map from roughly a year ago, August 21st, you'll notice much of the central part of the U.S. right through here was under extreme or exceptional drought. We look at this slide, this next slide here, that's overlaying the imported fire ant map, the quarantine map, and the drought monitor map. You'll notice that much of this area in red with the extreme and exceptional drought is not in a fire ant infested area. But these areas down here where it's showing up pink were non-drought areas and had ample hay. These folks up here did not. So there was transport of quite a bit of hay because of that. Now the next question, we received this question several times in Arkansas. Could imported fire ants survive in the uninfested areas north of the quarantine area? Yes, and we have examples of that. If you look 2010, Boone County, Fulton County, Washington County, even in the Missouri boot heel. A lot of these infestations, isolated infestations, I'll say, were the result of man-made spread. In many of these cases, it was landscape materials, things like that. So we do know that they could survive in these areas north of the quarantine line. Do we have any examples of transportation of imported fire ants in baled hay from last year? Yes, we do. We had, if you look, the north part of the state here, right around top two-tier counties in Arkansas, Izard, Marion, and Sharp, fire ant infested hay was observed in that area, brought into that area. May have come from Mississippi, Louisiana. Although we don't mention or are aware of any examples of infested hay moving from South Arkansas, it very likely did occur. And there's probably other similar examples of hay moving into southern Missouri. And I think on next,
hello, this is Charlie Brown. I'm with the United States Department of Agriculture, Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, Plant Protection and Quarantine. And tonight we'll be talking about regulatory considerations regarding shipping hay outside of the fire ant quarantine area. I'm the fire ant quarantine policy manager. Anne Marie Calcott will also present a presentation, and she is the science and technology person with the fire ant quarantine and heads up the methods development group. And also Ron Weeks will be talking. Ron is the national operations manager for the fire ant quarantine. And Ron, you'll be the first one up tonight. Can you please take us from here?
Yes, Charlie, thank you. So, can everyone hear me okay? Charlie?
Yes.
Thank you. Well, Kelly showed the drought map from 2012, and he did a good job of explaining that was a really abnormal year, especially we realized it in USDA for, many calls with Missouri and Arkansas over, a lot of hay moving in from various parts of the country. This is a drought map of recently of October 6th, and it is quite different. You see that the parts of Arkansas and Missouri and Oklahoma are not experiencing as severe a drought as they did last year, but things are really abnormally dry and moderate drought conditions. So again, this varies year to year about the amount of hay moving in, but it's still significant, and you may encounter situations where, folks don't have the hay they need and hay may move in. So I would say 2013 is better than last year, but certainly abnormally dry conditions can promote hay movement or hay demand. The next slide shows our imported fire ant quarantine, and you can see that a good part of Oklahoma, Arkansas are covered with fire ants, partially quarantined for fire ants. And this is just to give you a visual of how, the drought conditions overlay with the central part of the southeast quarantine area. Charlie will explain a little bit better in a moment, the significance of moving hay out of these red areas into the gray areas, non-quarantined areas. Now, a good resource for you and for folks you visit is how to find if you're inside or outside the fire ant quarantine. And Charlie has worked with some GIS folks to develop a web-enabled application where you can enter your zip code into a box, and it will tell you if you're fully quarantined or if your county is your zip code is partially quarantined. If it's partially quarantined, then you will have to go to the CFR and help delimit that. And that address is up here on the screen, and I know it is long, but Kathy's done a great job, I see, of providing links on the left-hand side for everyone. But in short, it can be found at our APHIS website under Plant Health and Plant Pest Information, and then Fire Ants. When you go to the Fire Ants page, there's a zip code link there to go to the zip code locator. Also, there's a bunch of the information that Kathy has posted on the left side under the Fire Ant page. Okay, Charlie?
Yes, thank you, Ron. Now, as far as the regulatory aspect of moving hay and not moving fire ants, the goal of the regulation and the goal of the regulation is to allow as much hay and straw to move while guarding against the further spread of imported fire ants. In other words, we certainly do not want to be overly restrictive here as far as hay moving. We realize that folks need that hay, and we want to do all we can to get that hay to move as long as the hay doesn't have fire ants. Another key point to remember is that all hay can move within the imported fire ant quarantine without any restriction. Ron showed us the map of the imported fire ant quarantine, which is in pink on this map. Hay within the quarantine can move without any restriction. So hay producer in the part of Texas that's within the quarantine can move the hay into the part of Arkansas that's within the quarantine without any restriction. Another key point is that hay not stored in direct contact with the ground is not regulated from a federal perspective. It's the hay that is in direct contact with the ground that can move fire ants. So hay sitting on the ground has the potential for fire ants to get into it, and that is regulated. If we look at the list of things that we regulate in the imported fire ant quarantine, it's things that pose a risk of moving fire ants long distances, a human-assisted movement, and it would be the fire ants can hitchhike on these regulated articles, and I won't read the whole list, but I will point out that baled hay and baled straw stored in direct contact with the ground are regulated in the imported fire ant quarantine. So let's look at some of these things here. Hay not stored in direct contact with the ground is not regulated. What do we mean by this? Here's an example of hay that is stored. It's got a tarp under it, so it is not in direct contact with the ground. This hay can move without certification outside of the fire ant quarantine, as far as the federal government is concerned. Hay that is stacked can move without certification outside of the fire ant quarantine if it's all the layers of hay above the bottom layer. In other words, in this picture, the bottom layer of hay is quarantined. However, everything above that bottom layer, the hay is regulated. The bottom layer is regulated. Everything above the bottom layer is not a regulated article from the federal perspective of the imported fire ant quarantine. So the question is, how can hay move outside of the fire ant quarantine? And I mentioned that hay not stored in direct contact with the ground is not regulated. And what we mean by stored in direct contact with the ground, some examples are hay that is cut, baled, and loaded without storage, or hay that is stored on a hard or impervious surface such as hard pan, asphalt, or concrete. What we're after here is having the hay on a surface where fire ants are not likely to be found and where the fire ants wouldn't get into the hay. Let's look at some examples of this. Here's a hay stored on, it's a little bit hard to tell exactly what the surface is, but it does not look to be in the field where the fire ants would be found, and this hay would be eligible to move outside of the fire ant without any certification. You can also store your hay above the soil on pallets, tires, or stored on landscaping cloth over the soil. Here's some examples of that. Hay stored on pallets. Hay stored on tires, so it's elevated over the ground. Hay on cloth in the field. Or hay that is totally wrapped in plastic and can be stored anywhere. As long as it's totally wrapped in plastic, it is considered to be not in direct contact with the ground. So I'll go over some of these points again. Hay can move outside the fire ant quarantine if it's not stored in direct contact with the ground. That hay is not regulated. Now, what about that hay that is stored in direct contact with the ground? What can you do with that? Hay that is stored in direct contact with the ground, if the hay grower has a compliance agreement with Plant Protection and Quarantine with USDA that gives the stipulations for what must be done as far as how that hay is handled so that it's fire ant free. If it's under a compliance agreement, it can move outside the quarantine. Another option is if the hay has been inspected by a state inspector from the State Department of Agriculture, and a certificate is issued stating that the hay is free of fire ants. So under those conditions, hay that is stored in direct contact with the ground can move outside the quarantine. Now here's the real-life consideration. Some hay buyers and others who are outside of the imported fire ant quarantine would be more comfortable if all hay was certified as free of fire ants, even though the hay was not stored in direct contact with the ground, which means it's not federally regulated. How can you tell when it's on the truck and it shows up at your place and you're buying hay? How can you tell if that hay is free of fire ants? And Anne-Marie Calcott will talk a little bit in a minute about keeping the fire ants out of the hay, and Kelly will also mention that later in this webinar. But each state must decide if they can or will inspect hay and issue certificates. We realize not every state will. We realize that there are some variations in the extent to which states have the ability to inspect hay and issue certificates. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture is working with the states to come up with maybe a better way to do this. But for now, the regulation, I'll repeat myself, says that hay that is stored in direct contact with the ground is a regulated article. And regulated articles can be inspected and moved if the state has the ability to do so. Now, there are other things that can be done to keep fire ants out of hay in the first place. And to tell us about that will be Anne-Marie Calcott, who is the science and technology person in the imported fire ant quarantine and our methods development person. Anne-Marie?
Thank you, Charlie. What I'm going to talk about are some best management practices for the shippers and receivers. Again, generally for regulated items, we actually have quarantine treatments for growers. For baled hay and straw, we really don't have this. We don't have any quarantine level effective treatments. So what we're doing, as Charlie has said, primarily you must get your hay inspected if you're going to ship it out of the regulated area and it's been stored on the ground. So to assist in this, we've come up with some best management practices, and I'm just going to give an overview of this, and then Kelly Lofton is going to talk in more detail about the specifics of some of these treatments a little bit later. But what we're trying to do is educate shippers and receivers on what they can do to alleviate the pressure of fire ants on the hay. Primarily for shippers, it would be really nice if they could treat their storage area prior to storing the hay, particularly if it's going to be outdoors in fire ant-prone areas. You can do this 7 to 10 days before you move the hay to that storage area. Primarily, you want to treat with a fire ant bait that's registered for pasture use, and there are a number of these available, and many are available in all are available in the fire ant quarantine states, and a lot of these are also available in adjacent states. It is best to extend your treatment area about 25 feet from where you are going to be placing your bales. This will allow any mounds that are kind of in the general area of your storage area to be treated with the fire ant bait. Most baits are fairly slow acting, 2 to 3 weeks, so that's why it's best if you do this a little ahead of time and kind of clean up your area as best you can. And if you're a receiver, you could do the same practice. Let me back up for just a second. As a receiver, once you get hay, if you have any concerns that there are fire ants in them, you could also treat around the hay bales with these fire ant baits. So this is the same type of treatment that we can use at the receiving end as well if we are suspicious that there are fire ants in that hay that has been received. You can also, shippers and receivers can treat any mounds that are adjacent to your storage area with an insecticide that's registered for fire ant and for hay. Carbaryl is the one that comes to mind and is the easiest to find and has both fire ants and hay on the label. Kelly will talk about some of the specifics of this, but there is a 14-day grazing restriction on this, so if you're treating out in an actual hayfield, you do need to be aware of that. It's a grazing restriction and a pre-harvest restriction on the carbaryl. So do pay attention to labels as you go through this. For receivers, same thing applies. Carbaryl and 7 is very available throughout the country. And if you do find a fire ant mound on some hay, you will be able to treat that out adjacent to the hay. You certainly don't want to put any of this directly on your hay, but it too is a treatment that can be allowed at the receiving end. Again, shippers and receivers, if there is any question that you might have some fire ants, you would want to inspect those bales for fire ant, place a food source, peanut butter, hot dog, corn oil soaked on an index card, anything like that on your hay, leave it 30 to 60 minutes, and then come back and look. Kelly will talk more about how to get these ants identified if there is a question, if you are uncertain if they are fire ants, and we won't tell you stick your finger in there, but that's your quick and easy answer. For receivers, when you're on the receiving end of this, ask the seller, the shipper, the broker, whoever it is, for hay that is free of fire ants. You are telling that person that you're buying from that you understand and recognize that fire ants are a problem and that you want them to ship hay that has been stored correctly or has been inspected and found free of fire ants. And from there, our last slide for the federal folks is our contact information again. Charlie Brown, myself, and Ron Weeks. There are our phone numbers. If you need to contact us for anything, please do so. As we mentioned, Charlie mostly works on the national side of policy, how the regulations work. I tend to work on the science and technology side of things, treatment development, and Ron tends to work on the operations side, the field side of things, that when we do have hay that's been shipped outside the regulated area that has fire ants on it, what do we do? How do we handle it? How do we help the states handle it if need be? That is the side that he works on. And from there, I think that I will be turning it over to Kelly Lofton.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. We'll just proceed on a little quicker on this. This section, we want to talk about identification, sampling, and some of the best management practices that Anne-Marie has already discussed. The first thing that we'll ask is, and this would be important for those in North Arkansas or Southern Missouri, how do you identify the fire ants? And the first thing that comes to mind is the aggressive demeanor when you disturb a mound, disturb a colony. There's also some characteristics of the mound itself that are pretty good for identification. Worker coloration and size ranges comes into play, and some key morphological characteristics that really come into play if you have a microscope. So if you look at fire ant behavior identification, when you disturb a colony, especially if it's during a time of year when the temperatures are above 65 at least, or at least sunny, those ants will basically come out in mass to defend that colony. So that's a good characteristic, because a lot of your native ants do not do that. And I'm not advocating getting stung, but if you do happen to get stung, there will be a burning sensation after the sting, and around 12 hours after that, you'll see a little white pustule form. So, again, not advocating getting stung, but that is a characteristic. If you look at the mound itself, here's a picture of a bale of hay. It's really hard to see the mound that's associated with that bale of hay, but you can kind of see a foraging trail right through there. But in general, a fire ant mound will look fluffy. The dirt will kind of look fluffy. I know that's not a scientific term, but it does. It looks like fluffy dirt. And there's not a central opening in that colony, in that mound. So it's not volcano-shaped. And the size of that mound is going to depend somewhat on age, soil type, and moisture content. The height of a mound may range from a couple inches to a couple of feet in an undisturbed area. Here we can look at a few mounds. It's real common, especially in newly infested areas and other areas, to find colonies associated with a sidewalk or a fence. And that's showing a colony right there. This is a fairly new colony, actually on the edge of a soybean field. Here's a colony that's in a sandier type soil that's pretty flattened. And here's a typical colony you would see at the edge of a pasture field. But all these colonies or mounds have in common no central opening, and they look somewhat fluffy. Oops. As far as the workers, the red imported fire ant is reddish brown. The black imported fire ant and hybrid are brownish black, almost bronze. Another very good characteristic is that the workers vary in size, from an eighth to a quarter of an inch in length. That's a really good characteristic. This just shows you the color of the red imported and the black imported, and the hybrid. This is the red. This is the black. Hybrid would look very similar. So there is a difference in color between the two. Now we'll look at morphological characteristics, and again they require a microscope. The antennae consist of 10 segments. The antennal club consists of 2 segments. The antennal scape almost reaches the vertex or top of the head. The mandibles possess 4 teeth. They possess a medium papial tooth, and the pedestal or waist consists of 2 noses. And we'll go over each of these. I think you'll see what I'm talking about. If you look at the antenna, this is the entire antenna. Count all those segments, there's 10. This is the scape. That's the first segment. It almost reaches, and at this angle it shows that it goes past, but it reaches the top of the head. Then if you look at the end of the antenna, see this club? It consists of 2 segments. Good characteristic for fire ants. Another good characteristic are the mandibular teeth. This is a mandible, this is a mandible. If you look carefully, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 teeth. The other characteristic, it's harder to see, they possess a medial papial tooth. Basically what I'm saying is there's a tooth on its upper lip. That's not scientific, but that's the best way to describe it. Kind of a spine there on its upper lip. Okay. Now as far as the pedestal, easy characteristic, you've got a 2-segment pedestal. talking about is 1, 2. Other ants have that as well, but it'll get you into the right area. Next thing is, where's the best location to look for fire ant infestations associated with this infested hay? Obviously, the hay storage site would be a good place to look. Hay feeding sites, and associated with those two sites, any protected area, like adjacent to buildings, concrete slabs, fences, any place that can collect solar heat, solar energy, basically heat sun. That helps a lot in their survival, as well as safe south-facing slopes. Now, assume you locate a suspect imported fire ant colony. How do you collect them, or you suspect fire ants? You can basically locate the colony and collect the workers. Be careful not to get stung, though. Collect workers from a colony. Put them in alcohol. Or you can place bait stations in areas of concern and do that when the soil temperature is above 65 degrees Fahrenheit. I like to use 1/4-inch cubes of hot dog. You can use peanut butter, other material, to place in the lid of a pill vial or white paper, something to provide contrast. I like the pill vial because you can slap the other end, the vial end over it and not get stung. So you leave that sample out for 30 minutes. Collect the sample. After you collect that sample, what do you do with it? If possible, obtain GPS coordinates and at least provide the address of the sample. One thing that GPS coordinates will allow us is to see if there's expansion and to be able to go back to that area if you do locate fire ants and be able to do some follow-up treatments. You will want to take that sample to the local Cooperative Extension Service office or the State Ag Department. And of course, they're being confirmed as fire ants. You're going to want to initiate fire ant control, especially if you're well north of that infestation or that quarantine line. Now let's assume you're in an uninfested area. How do you control fire ants? And we're going to assume in a pasture. The key to control is always killing the queen. If the ground temperatures are above 65 degrees Fahrenheit, you can apply fire ant bait. But I always recommend before applying fire ant bait in an area like this to make certain that the ants are foraging. We can use hot dogs or, like we described in the slide or two ago, something just to see if the ants are gathering food. You don't want to apply fire ant bait when it's raining, or expecting rain, or on wet ground. Simply, fire ants, they do not like soggy bait. The broadcast rates vary from 1 to 1.5 pounds per acre. Individual mound rates vary from 2 to 5 tablespoons per mound. And they're going to vary depending on what product you have. Along those same lines, how would you control them? What baits would you use? Those that are approved for use on pastures include Amdro Pro fire ant bait, Extinguish Professional fire ant bait, Extinguish Plus fire ant bait, or Esteem fire ant bait. What would you do if temperatures are below 65 degrees, but you locate a colony and you're pretty sure almost certain it's a fire ant colony? What can you do? It's too cold to use a bait. You can treat individual mounds with carbaryl. And the reason I mention carbaryl is simply because it's a product that has fire ants on the label and is approved for pasture use, with that 14-day withdrawal period. Only use insecticides approved for pastures and for fire ant control. Make certain the product is approved for use in your state. Always follow directions. Now, we've run into this next point in Arkansas in the past. Since Arkansas's got a fire ant area and a fire ant area, sometimes we'll run into isolated infestations where the producer can't find bait locally. So what they'll have to do is actually get a vendor to order in those baits. Usually they can get them pretty quickly. After you've begun your treatment regime for fire ants, probably be a good idea to continue monitoring for their presence and retreat. It's not a one-shot deal unless you happen to only have one colony for them. Continue monitoring. Now, this is something that happened last year. Assume you purchased fire ant infested hay. How can you minimize possibility of establishment on your property? The first thing you can think about is you identify them on the trailer, see if the shipper will take it back. In some cases, that won't happen. They won't take it back. So what do? What we've recommended is to treat that hay storage area prior to storage. And the recommended product in those cases has been carbaryl at the maximum pasture rate of 1.5 pounds active per acre. Yearly maximum application is 3 pounds AI per acre. So you could apply the carbaryl. After you apply that carbaryl, place the hay on a barrier, which can be plastic sheeting that's at least 6 mil thick, something like that, between the hay and the treated area. After that, make certain that you have a treated area around the perimeter of that plastic barrier, or around the haystack. So if the ants happen to move out of the hay, they'll encounter a treated area. Now, if fire ants are present after you've stacked that hay, you can apply fire ant bait on the perimeter of the hay, not on the hay, but on the perimeter. And you can use the labeled rates. Figure if it's a pound per acre or a pound and a half, figure those rates, and then just apply it on that the perimeter of the hay. Again, use only insecticides approved for pasture use and fire ant control. Make sure it's approved for your state. Now, assume you produce hay in a imported fire ant quarantined area, which we've had this question for South Arkansas. You can only stack your hay on the ground. You don't have a hard pack. You don't have a concrete floor with a nice barn, but you want to sell fire ant-free hay. What can you do? And Charlie already mentioned this, but you can load hay onto the transport trailer immediately after you bale. Another thing you could do is sell the fire ant-free hay from the upper layers of the haystack. And pretty simple here. You know, this along the bottom, you know, was potentially fire ant infested, so it'd have to be inspected and all that. But all this hay stacked above that could be shipped. So you could sell that hay easily without inspection. Now, back to that same producer, say, that's producing hay in a quarantined area and only stack on the ground. Another thing they should do is not leave the baled hay in the field for a long period of time. Instead, move it over to the treated hay storage area. If you look at this field, that hay is the grass in that hay, the Bermuda, is within a week of the second cutting, and you still have hay out from the first cutting. That would lend its way to becoming infested with fire ants. there was a question about what would you call immediate, and probably, if possible, maybe Anne Marie or Charlie could chime in, or even Paul Shell. I think they're looking at probably a few days. Would one of y'all want to chime in? 5 days, you think?
Hey, Kelly.
Yeah.
Kelly, this is Ron. A few days I don't think would work. Just from our experience down in Gulfport, when we would drop hay out in a field, by the next day we could go out and find them snuggled up next to the to the bale. Immediate. Just a few out. I had the question by the end of the day. Within a 24-hour period, I still think. After that period, you're really increasing your risk potential there. We don't have a good fix on that. We know how hard it is to bale this and get the trucks there and the tractor to load it on time. So we don't have a hard, fast rule on that.
So it'd be best if it's within a day of cutting and baling.
Well, our experience is, by the time the next day, there can be ants snuggled up there. You could drop the bale on a colony there in the field. If they're in the field, you can be baling it right on top of them. So it's a tough deal.
Mm-hmm.
But your chances of, if you drop it on a mound, and then you pick it up, the chances are it hasn't become per se infested with the whole colony. So Paul has it within 24 hours. I think that's a good call. Anything more than that, they really can organize after the cutting and move up next to them. It's a very disturbing time for them after during the baling process. They kind of scattered and. They don't per se have their house in order to move, underneath that bale or into the very bottom layer. I'll ask Anne Marie to kind of, fill in or validate that for me, if she doesn't mind, or Charlie.
Yes, I see where Paul Shell with the Arkansas Department of Agriculture says that their policy is if it's loaded within 24 hours of baling.
Yes, that is correct. That's what we've been going by, Charlie.
Good.
I think that's a pretty good policy. It's the best you can do. I mean, there's no way you can get it without it touching the ground for a minute, but the key is the storage part.
Appreciate it.
Good question, Lee. Does everybody read Kathy's answer? That's very true. Would be nice to be able to kill two birds at one stone.
Yeah.
But you have to apply the bait separately.
Okay. Appreciate it. Now this is kind of redundant, this slide about treating the hay storage area, but we'll go ahead and mention it. You'd treat that hay storage area with a fire ant bait approved for pasture use about a week or so, week to 2 weeks before storing the hay. Stack hay in the treated hay storage area on a barrier. The barrier could be 6-mil plastic sheeting or other material, basically something that's going to be sturdy enough to prevent hay and soil contact. And then you'd maintain a 25-foot minimum insecticide barrier around the perimeter of that hay storage area. And that could be fire ant bait. Again, a bait that's registered for use on pastures. And then I would recommend, and I think the Department of Ag recommends this after you've stored it in a hay storage area that's been treated. You want to monitor for fire ant presence. I think that's something that's recommended. Monitor, detect fire ants in that storage area.
Sure. Yeah, Kelly, that's always a good idea. Keep up with little critters because they're pernicious and determined.
Yeah.
So.
And again.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, definitely.
And once they become infested, that's another point. What's the recommendation from either Paul or USDA once you start identifying fire ants in your treated hay storage area? What would be the recommendation?
Well, I would say don't move that. Don't move that hay outside of the quarantine if you're seeing fire ants in there. If it's low to the ground and you've got 2 or more stacked high, then the fire ants should not be in the upper levels. But that's about all I can think of, other than because
I would agree with you completely. Once they get in there, there's not much else you can do. I mean, you can't. You're potentially shipping infested hay at that point, other than the top layers. Good comment. Let's see. Actually, I just realized that was the last slide. There's going to be a few questions, I think.
Yes, we want to ask any cattlemen if you buy or sell hay, if you could answer a few extra questions for us. And I've pasted that SurveyMonkey link into the chat box. And then, Kelly, if you want to just advance the slide, we have some questions, I think, for all of us to answer, if everyone could just stay on the line. And if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat box.
Sure, appreciate those that were able to attend. Sure do. Whoops, went too far. Kathy, do I need to do anything? Oh, there they are.
Okay, Kelly, I think if you want to just advance to the next slide, and then Donna's got a question.
Appreciate y'all for participating in this seminar. And Donna was asking about the APIS links to state information. I think that is on the USDA side. Is that correct? Or maybe
yeah, this is
the USDA
Yeah, this is Charlie. As Anne Marie typed, the National Plant Board site has the state-specific information, and we have a link to the National Plant Board site from the APHIS website.
Okay, good. Good.
And I think I just pasted that into the chat box. Or maybe not.
It's there.
I see it.
Well, Kelly, Kathy, Seth, this is Ron Weeks. This was a nice seminar, a nice forum you did. I hope, looks like everybody got some information and some learned a lot. I appreciate the opportunity to talk on this. The take home is in emergency situations, we all have to work together to, meet emergency hay situations, but also protect ourselves from unneeded risk for fire ants. So the more we can have these types of discussions and educate folks, I think the risk is much lower. So thanks for this forum. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it very much.
Hey, this is Anne Marie. I couldn't seem to type fast enough. Tim had asked another question about negative bait stations and calling things fire ant free. I'd say if you have good coverage with your bait stations and you don't see any foraging ants and you don't see any mounds, and after an hour you've put some good baits out about 10 feet apart and you feel like you've covered your area real well, I would say you could probably easily ship that day, and you could probably ship the next day if you do a quick walk around and make sure that you don't see any ants coming into your area. Ants will move overnight and they will move very quickly. So I would say it would really just be like one day, and then you would need to rebait.
Could I make a comment, Anne Marie?
Yes, please do.
One thing I'd like to mention, when you're baiting for these ants, the time of day makes a lot of difference too. You can get false negatives when you're up 95 to 100 degrees in the hot sun too.
Good. Yes, that's a good point. Try to do it between 65 and under 90, not direct sunlight, and 90 if you can. So actually in the middle of the summer, the mornings are probably better. And there was another question, honeybees and fire ant bait. Probably, I would be careful putting anything around honeybees. We don't have, as far as I know, I don't think that there is any information. Look at the label would be my first thing to tell you. Look at the label, see if there is. I don't remember honeybees being on fire ant bait labels. It's on all the contact insecticides. Be very careful with 7 around honeybees. But the baits probably will be okay. They're an oil base, not a sugar base, so I'm going to guess that most honeybees would not be attracted to it. And if there are any fire ants in the area, they will pick those up generally within a few hours, and other ants will get them pretty quickly as well.
Another thing on those honeybees, perhaps you could think about the behavior of the honeybees is that they tend to they go into the hive at night, and fire ants will forage at night. So if you put your baits out late in the day, that also minimizes the chances of exposure.
Good point.
Okay. Kelly, you have any wrap-up for us?
Just appreciate y'all that attended, and it's going to be available recorded. Is the address up here, or they go to the e-extension site to? Okay. Kathy just put that up for the recording, and there's some other fire ant information available on extension.org fire ants, and then Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Pinterest. I appreciate y'all attending. I think that's the last slide. Yep. You need to add anything, Kathy?
Just want to thank everybody for participating, and also Donna was asking, will there be some more webinars? And there are some more webinars coming up as part of the Don't Bug Me webinar series, and I think the first one is going to be September 4th. It's the first Wednesday of the month at 1 o'clock Central Time at the same classroom that you came in here. So if you want to know more about fire ants and using fire ant baits, fall is a good time to apply fire ant baits. Will be September 4th at 1 p.m. Central Time at the location you dialed in on tonight. Thank you.
Thanks.